They say blood is thicker than water. For my family, it was just a cover for an extortion racket. I built $1 million tech empire from the ashes of the credit score they destroyed when I was 22. Years later, my own father sued me to steal my life's work for my sister. He thought I would simply surrender. Instead, the judge looked him dead in the eye and delivered exactly 2 words that destroyed his entire world. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Maya Revenge Stories, and thank you so sincerely for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled our monetization, leaving us without the budget to keep the channel running and support our hardworking team. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our staff for their living expenses and continue creating more stories for you. You can do this by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donate link in the description and comments below. My name is Tabitha Baldwin, and I am 31 years old. If you want to understand the exact flavor of toxicity my family specialized in, you only needed to spend 5 minutes at my father's annual summer barbecue. Richard Baldwin, a former banking executive whose entire existence was tethered to his zip code and his golf handicap, hosted these events at his sprawling lakefront mansion in Austin, Texas. The air was always thick with the scent of hickory smoke, expensive cologne, and a desperation to appear richer than the person standing next to you. It was an atmosphere built entirely on money, yet completely hollow inside. I sat quietly in a shaded corner of the limestone patio, wearing a simple linen shirt and plain slacks. I was a ghost in my own family's house, utterly out of place among the sea of designer silk, Rolex watches, and booming conversations about stock portfolios and imported supercars. I preferred it that way. Invisibility lay danger. The absolute focal point of the afternoon, as always, was my 29-year-old sister, Sloane. Sloane was the quintessential golden child, an Instagram lifestyle influencer who never met a reflective surface she did not love. She stood by the infinity pool, holding a crystal glass of champagne, holding court among a group of my father's wealthy friends and their perfectly manicured wives. She was loudly bragging about her newest interior design brand. "It is all about curating an authentic, bespoke aesthetic," Sloane declared, her voice carrying over the gentle hum of the jazz band playing on the lawn. "Every piece in my new collection is ethically sourced and custom designed for the modern elite." I took a slow sip of my sparkling water and looked away. I knew for a fact that her bespoke furniture consisted of cheap, mass-produced imports that she slapped a designer label on and marked up by 400%. But in the Baldwin family, reality was irrelevant. Perception was the only currency that mattered, and my father beamed at her with a sickening kind of pride, playing the role of the supportive patriarch. Then, the illusion shattered. It happened because of a man named Arthur, a loud, gregarious tech investor from Silicon Valley, whom my father had been aggressively courting for a potential real estate venture. Arthur was weaving through the crowd when he suddenly stopped, his eyes locking onto me in my quiet corner. His face lit up with absolute shock and immediate recognition. "Tabitha? Tabitha Baldwin?" Arthur bellowed, his voice cutting through the polite chatter of the patio like a chainsaw. He marched over, completely ignoring my father, who was trying to offer him a plate of brisket. "I cannot believe it. What are you doing hiding back here?" Before I could shush him or deflect, Arthur turned to the surrounding crowd, practically radiating excitement. "Richard, you sly dog. Why did you not tell me your daughter is the founder of Aegis Crypt Solutions? Tabitha, congratulations. I saw the industry report this morning. Your firm just made the top $1 million startup list. That impenetrable data encryption technology you built is the absolute talk of the valley. Everyone is terrified of you, and it is brilliant." The entire party froze. The clinking of glasses stopped. The jazz band seemed to fade into the background. I watched the ripple effect of Arthur's words wash over my family. Sloane's picture-perfect smile twisted into a grotesque mask of extreme, unfiltered jealousy. Her knuckles turned white around her champagne glass as the spotlight was violently ripped away from her fake furniture empire. but it was my father's reaction that chilled me to the bone. Richard Baldwin looked at me, and his expression morphed rapidly from utter bewilderment to a cold, calculating fury. He did not see a daughter who had achieved something remarkable. He saw an asset he did not control. He excused himself from Arthur with a tight, practiced smile, then walked over to me, his fingers wrapped around my upper arm with a bruising grip. Tabitha, in my study, now. He did not wait for my answer, practically dragging me through the house, away from the staring eyes of his guests. The moment we crossed the threshold of his oak-paneled study, he slammed the heavy door shut, sealing us in dead silence. There was no congratulation. There was no pride. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" he hissed, his face inches from mine, the mask of the charming host completely gone. "You are selfishly hiding assets while your sister is out there struggling to build her brand? You sit in my backyard, playing the pathetic pauper, while you are sitting on $1 million company?" I pulled my arm out of his grasp, my heart pounding, but my voice remained dead calm. "It is my company. Richard, I built it from nothing. This family shares its successes," he barked, slamming his fist onto his mahogany desk. "Sloan needs a cash injection for her supply chain. You are going to transfer 30% of your equity into the family trust by Monday morning. It is the least you can do after everything I have provided for you." I looked at the man who had thrown me to the wolves a decade prior. He truly believed he owned me. I buttoned my linen jacket, looked him dead in the eyes, and gave him my answer. Absolutely not. I turned on my heel, walked out of the study, and left the mansion, driving away into the hot Texas night without looking back. As my tires ate up the dark asphalt of the highway leading away from the lake, the cool air from the car vents did nothing to chill the fire burning in my chest. My father actually thought he could claim my life's work. To understand the sheer audacity of Richard Baldwin demanding a piece of my empire, you have to understand how he left me to die in the financial wilderness 9 years ago. I was 22 years old. I had just graduated magna cum laude with a degree in computer science. I had the world by the throat, clutching a signed offer letter for a junior security engineering role at a massive global tech conglomerate. I was finally going to be completely independent, ready to step out of the suffocating shadow of my family. That was when my father invited me to a private dinner. It was not to celebrate my graduation, but to ambush me. Sloan had decided she wanted to be a fashion mogul and needed to open a boutique in a prime retail district. The bank required a guarantor for the commercial lease and the startup capital. My father, claiming his assets were temporarily tied up in a complicated offshore trust, looked at me across a white tablecloth and pushed a thick stack of loan documents toward my plate. "It is just a formality, Tabitha," he had said, using that smooth, authoritative banker voice that always made you feel like you were making a smart investment. "You have no debt and a pristine, blank credit history. Sloan needs this stepping stone. I will pay everything, every single month. Your name just sits on the paper. Do this for your family." I hesitated, but the psychological weight of a father telling his young daughter that she held the key to her sister's happiness was overwhelmingly heavy. I signed my name, guaranteeing a commercial loan of $100,000. It took exactly 8 months for the entire house of cards to collapse. Sloan did not build a business. She used the boutique's operating capital as a personal slush fund, flying to Paris for so-called sourcing trips and buying luxury handbags she claimed were store displays. When the business inevitably filed for bankruptcy, the bank did not care about Sloan's carefully curated social media image. They cared about the guarantor. They came for me. I went to my father, panicked, expecting him to fix it as he had promised. Instead, he simply refused to take my calls. When I finally cornered him in his study, he coldly stated that his financial advisor had warned against taking on toxic debt, and that this was a harsh but necessary business lesson for me. He abandoned the debt entirely. The fallout was apocalyptic. The debt went straight into collections. My pristine credit score was annihilated overnight, plummeting into the low 400s. In the cybersecurity industry, trust is everything. When my prospective employer ran a routine pre-employment financial background check for my security clearance, they saw a massive, defaulted commercial loan. They rescinded my job offer immediately, in the span of a few weeks. I lost my future, my financial standing, and my safety net. I was drowning in a sea of aggressive collection calls, and my family stood on the shore watching me sink. I remember standing in the marble foyer of my parents' house, tears of absolute desperation in my eyes, pleading with my mother, Eleanor, to intervene. She did not even look up from her tablet. She simply adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet and sighed with mild annoyance. "Sisters must sacrifice for each other. Tabitha," she murmured. "Sloane is fragile right now after her business failed. You are the tough one. You are so smart. You can always take care of yourself." That was the exact moment the final thread tying me to them snapped. I realized a harsh, grotesque truth. In my parents' eyes, my independence was never something to be proud of. It was merely a convenience. Because I was self-sufficient, they could wash their hands of me entirely and free up their time to pour 100% of their financial resources, emotional energy, and unconditional love into their golden child. I was not a daughter to them. I was a utility. I walked out of that house and changed my phone number that same afternoon. I severed every single tie. I moved into a rundown, old-smelling apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city because I could not get a traditional lease with my ruined credit. I paid an exorbitant premium in cash to a shady landlord who asked no questions. I sat on a bare mattress on the floor, shivering in the winter drafts, and opened my cheap, overheating laptop. To survive, I took on 3 freelance programming jobs at once. I operated entirely under my middle name, Marie, so my ruined credit history would not block my freelance contracts. I coded until my eyes bled. I slept maybe 2 or 3 hours a night, fueled by cheap instant coffee and a burning, icy rage that refused to extinguish. In that tiny, miserable room, between fixing broken databases for local plumbers and writing back-end scripts for small online retailers, I started building my own encryption protocols. I turned my trauma and my isolation into impenetrable code. I built Aegis Crypt solutions line by agonizing line in the dark, completely alone. My family thought they had buried me under the weight of Sloane's failures. They did not realize they had planted a seed. Exactly 7 days after I walked out of that suffocating lake house, reality came crashing through the glass doors of my corporate headquarters. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my glass-walled boardroom on the 20th floor of downtown Austin, finalizing a massive cybersecurity infrastructure contract with the Texas State Bar Association. We were discussing the deployment of multi-layered encryption protocols when my executive assistant stepped into the room. Her face was pale, and her professional composure was visibly shaken. She leaned down and whispered that there was a gentleman in the lobby who refused to leave until he placed an envelope directly into my physical hands. In the corporate world, you learn very quickly what that means. I excused myself from the partners, projecting absolute calm, and walked out to the reception area. A man in a rumpled suit handed me a thick manila envelope, asked me to confirm my identity, and then uttered the standard phrase that officially initiates a legal war. "You have been served." I walked back to my private office, locked the door, and tore open the seal. The heavy formal legal stationery felt like sandpaper against my fingertips. I scanned the plaintiff line. It read, "The Baldwin Family Trust, represented by Richard Baldwin." I read the core demands, and a sharp, cynical laugh actually escaped my throat. My father was not just suing me, he was attempting a hostile takeover of my entire existence. The lawsuit demanded punitive damages and a mandatory transfer of 40% equity in Aegis Crypt Solutions directly to his trust. But it was the grounds for the lawsuit that vaulted the entire situation from malicious into the realm of absolute delusion. According to the 60-page complaint filed by his high-priced downtown lawyers, I had allegedly breached a fiduciary duty to my family. The document shamelessly claimed that the foundational algorithm for my encryption software was not my own invention, but was somehow conceptualized during casual family dinner conversations. He accused me of stealing proprietary intellectual property that rightfully belonged to the Baldwin household. Furthermore, he claimed that I had maliciously hijacked his elite business relationships in the tech sector to secure my initial seed funding, deliberately cutting him out to enrich myself and actively hindering my sister's career progression by hoarding the family's resources. It was a masterclass in legal fiction. My father, a man who could barely restart his own wireless router, was claiming he had brainstormed military-grade data encryption algorithms over roast beef and mashed potatoes. He was claiming I used his contacts, when in reality, I had built my company under a pseudonym while hiding in a slum, precisely to avoid his toxic orbit. A normal daughter, even an estranged one, might have broken down in tears at this point. When a child is targeted by a parent with the full, terrifying weight of the American judicial system, the natural instinct is to panic, to call them, to beg for reconciliation, or to ask what it would take to make the nightmare stop. That is exactly what a narcissistic manipulator banks on. They rely on your emotional vulnerability to force a quick, terrified settlement. But as I stood by my floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the Austin skyline, my eyes remained completely dry. The last shred of naive hope that I might actually have a father died right there on the carpet of my office. He did not see a human being when he looked at me. He did not see a daughter who had clawed her way out of the financial grave he had dug for her. He saw a highly profitable asset that was currently resisting foreclosure. He viewed me the exact same way he viewed a defaulting real estate property, and he was using the courts as his collection agency. Instead of fear, I felt an absolute, terrifying coldness flood my veins. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The anxiety that had haunted my 20s evaporated, replaced by a hyper-focused, lethal clarity. My father wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate warfare. He had no idea he had just challenged a grandmaster to a blood sport. I picked up my phone and bypassed my regular corporate counsel. I dialed a private number I kept for extreme emergencies. "Victor," I said when the line clicked open. Victor was a notoriously ruthless litigation attorney based in Houston. He was a shark in a tailored suit. A man who did not practice law to find amicable resolutions. He practiced law to completely eviscerate his opponents. He was the kind of lawyer you hired when you wanted to salt the earth so nothing could ever grow there again. "Tabitha," Victor replied, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need to retain you for a civil defense case," I stated, my voice steady and hard. "My father just sued me for 40% of my company. He is claiming intellectual property theft and breach of fiduciary duty." There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a dark, amused chuckle. "Your father? That is a bold strategy. What is the objective? Do you want me to make this quietly go away?" "No," I replied, staring at the legal document on my desk. "I do not want a settlement. I do not want mediation. I want you to drag him through the discovery process. I want you to subpoena every single financial record he has ever touched. I want you to dismantle his entire fake empire, brick by brick. We are not just going to win this case. Victor, we are going to utterly destroy his pride." The psychological warfare began exactly 3 days after the lawsuit landed on my desk. In any toxic family dynamic, when the primary aggressor fails to break your boundaries through sheer force, they inevitably send in their flying monkeys. For my family, that role was flawlessly executed by my mother. My private cell phone rang at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night. I stared at the glowing screen, watching Eleanor's name flash in the darkness of my apartment. I let it ring 5 times before I finally swiped to answer, hitting the record button on my secure internal server simultaneously. "Tabitha, darling, please." My mother's voice trembled through the speaker. It was a masterfully crafted performance, dripping with weaponized tears and breathless panic. "You have to stop this nonsense. You are tearing our family apart. I am not the one who filed a frivolous lawsuit." "Eleanor," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Your father is just under an immense amount of pressure," she sobbed, playing the ultimate victim. Sloane's supply chain is experiencing a temporary cash flow hiccup, and Richard is trying to protect her. Please, Tabitha, you have so much. Just liquidate a tiny fraction of your company. If you wire us $500,000 in cash by the end of the week, I promise I can convince your father to drop the entire lawsuit. We just need to handle a small misunderstanding with the tax authorities, and then everything can go back to normal. I froze. The ambient noise of the city traffic outside my window seemed to vanish. $500,000? In cash. For a tax misunderstanding. People who have minor clerical errors with the Internal Revenue Service do not demand $500,000 in untraceable liquid funds from their estranged children. They hire a certified public accountant. The sheer magnitude of that number, combined with her desperate plea for cash, triggered every single analytical alarm bell in my brain. My mother, in her frantic attempt to manipulate me, had just handed me the key to a very dark, very heavy vault. I will think about it, I said flatly, and disconnected the call before she could utter another word. I did not go to sleep that night. Instead, I walked over to my multi-monitor workstation, cracked my knuckles, and opened a secure, encrypted terminal. I was a cybersecurity architect. My entire life was built on finding anomalies in massive datasets. If my family was hiding a financial black hole, I was going to find the event horizon. I wrote a custom data scraping script and deployed it across public domains. I pulled every publicly available corporate filing, property deed, and uniform commercial code record registered under Richard Baldwin and Sloane Baldwin in the state of Texas and Delaware, to supplement my digital dragnet. I wired a hefty premium to a private investigator, a former forensic accountant who specialized in tracing hidden offshore assets. I gave him 72 hours to follow the physical money trail of Sloane's supposedly booming interior design brand. What we unearthed over the next 3 days was not just a failing business, it was a staggering, catastrophic crime scene. Sloane was not an entrepreneur. She was a criminal. Her luxury bespoke furniture company was nothing more than a textbook, small-scale Ponzi scheme masked by Instagram filters. She had been taking massive upfront deposits from wealthy clients and private investors, promising them exclusive, custom-built imports, but no furniture was ever manufactured. Instead, Sloane was using the new deposits to issue partial refunds to the angry early investors who were threatening to sue her, while aggressively siphoning off the rest to fund her lavish lifestyle. First-class flights to Dubai, designer wardrobes, and luxury car leases were all being paid for by stolen investor capital. But the real shockwave came when the private investigator handed me the dossier on my father. When Sloane's pyramid scheme inevitably began to collapse under its own weight a few months ago, Richard did not turn her in. Instead, his fragile ego and desperate need to maintain the illusion of high society perfection drove him to become an accomplice. Public records showed that my father had quietly taken out a massive, high-interest second mortgage on the Austin lakefront mansion. He had liquidated his retirement portfolios and maxed out multiple corporate credit lines, secretly funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into Sloane's shell company to keep the angry investors at bay. It was not enough. The hole was too deep. My investigator uncovered that a whistleblower had recently tipped off the authorities. Currently, both Richard and Sloane were under active, covert criminal investigation by the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation for wire fraud and tax evasion. Suddenly, the bizarre, delusional lawsuit against me made perfect, terrifying sense. My father did not actually want to manage a cybersecurity firm. He did not care about my encryption algorithms. He was quite literally backed into a corner, staring down the barrel of a federal prison sentence. He was attempting to extort 40% of my equity because Aegis Crypt Solutions was a highly valued, liquid asset. His master plan was to use my stolen shares as collateral to secure a massive, unregulated loan from an underground shadow syndicate, loan sharks, to pay off the feds and the remaining investors before the indictments dropped. I was not a daughter to him. I was his ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. I sat in the dim light of my office, reading the final pages of the forensic report. The sheer audacity of their corruption was breathtaking. They were perfectly willing to let me lose everything I had built, to tie me to a criminal enterprise, just to save themselves. I printed every single document, bank statement, wire transfer log, and tax lien. I placed them into a heavy, black leather binder. The next morning, I walked into the downtown offices of my ruthless litigator, Victor. I dropped the heavy binder onto his glass desk. The loud thud echoed in the quiet room. Victor looked up from his notepad, raising an eyebrow at the massive stack of paper. "What is this?" Victor asked, leaning back in his leather chair. "This," I said, a cold, predatory smile finally touching the corners of my mouth, "is the weapon we are going to use to execute Richard Baldwin in open court. Tell the judge we are ready for the preliminary hearing." In the high-stakes game of corporate litigation, the most dangerous weapon you can wield is your opponent's own arrogance. Victor understood this better than anyone. He did not immediately file a motion to dismiss the lawsuit. Instead, he initiated a deliberate, agonizingly slow campaign of psychological attrition during the discovery phase. For 2 solid months, Victor dragged his feet. He filed endless extension requests. When we finally handed over documents, they were heavily redacted, mostly useless corporate bylaws and generic financial summaries. To the opposing counsel, and more importantly to my father, it painted a very specific picture. It made it look like I was terrified, desperately stonewalling because I knew I was losing the battle and had no real defense. We were feeding my father's ego, letting it swell to catastrophic proportions. This strategy culminated in a stifling, windowless conference room in downtown Austin for the official deposition. A court reporter sat in the corner, her fingers hovering over the stenograph, ready to record every single word under penalty of perjury. My father sat across the polished mahogany table, flanked by his 2 expensive lawyers. He looked like a king who had already conquered the castle, adjusting his silk tie with a smug, self-satisfied grin. Throughout the grueling 4-hour session, Richard Baldwin was spectacularly condescending. He treated the deposition not as a legal proceeding, but as a grand stage to assert his total dominance over my life. When Victor gently pressed him on the origin of my company's software, my father leaned back, steepled his fingers, and smiled with sickening superiority. "Tabitha is a smart girl, certainly," Richard testified, his voice dripping with paternalistic venom. "But she lacks vision. I created the foundation for her success. I provided the roof over her head, the education, the dinner table where the real intellectual property of Aegis Crypt was conceptualized. Her company is merely a byproduct of my financial and intellectual investment in her upbringing." I sat perfectly still. I kept my shoulders slumped slightly, my eyes downcast, actively projecting the image of a defeated, intimidated daughter. Inside, my heart was beating with the steady, rhythmic precision of a metronome. I was letting him talk. I was letting him spin a web of lies so tight he would never be able to breathe again. Victor subtly shifted the topic toward the financial structures of our family, baiting the trap. "So, Mr. Baldwin, you believe you have a legal right to unilaterally redirect the assets of a privately held corporation to another sibling?" My father scoffed, leaning aggressively over the table, his face flushing with arrogant certainty. He looked directly at me, not at Victor, and delivered the fatal blow to his own case on the official, sworn record. "She owes her sister," Richard declared, his voice echoing loudly in the small room. "This family is a single financial entity, and I am the one who decides who benefits. I decide who gets funded and who pays their dues. Tabitha is hoarding family resources, and the court will correct this gross imbalance." Victor did not argue. He simply thanked my father for his time and ended the deposition. As we walked to the elevator, Victor looked at me and gave a single, cold nod. The snare was fully set. 3 weeks later, the day of the preliminary hearing finally arrived. The Travis County Courthouse was a towering structure of cold granite and polished marble, a place where absolute truths were meant to be separated from fiction. We took our seats at the defense table, across the aisle. The Baldwin family made their entrance. Sloane strutted into the courtroom, looking like she was attending a tragic red carpet event. She was dressed in a ridiculously expensive, funereal black designer suit, carrying a crocodile skin handbag that likely cost more than a mid-sized sedan. She immediately began dabbing her completely dry eyes with a silk tissue, playing the role of the innocent, victimized younger sister whose brilliant future had been maliciously stolen by her greedy sibling. She was trying to secure the judge's pity before he even took the bench. My father sat beside her, exuding supreme confidence. His legal team wheeled in two massive carts, stacked high with intimidating bankers' boxes full of printed emails, speculative charts, and character testimonies. They wanted to overwhelm the judge with sheer volume, to create a spectacle of undeniable familial betrayal. At our table, the contrast was absolute. There were no carts. There were no mountains of paperwork. Victor and I sat in total silence. Resting directly in front of Victor was a single, thin black folder containing the forensic financial report and the loan documents from when I was 22 years old. We did not need a spectacle. We just needed to wait for the exact moment when my father finished digging his own grave, so we could simply push him in. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung shut, sealing us all inside. The bailiff ordered everyone to rise, and the final countdown to my father's destruction officially began. The opposing counsel, a man with a heavily starched collar and a booming, theatrical voice, finally concluded his exhausting 90-minute presentation. He leaned heavily on the podium, pointing a dramatic finger in my direction. "Your Honor, given the plaintiff's undeniable foundational contribution to the defendant's intellectual property, we request an immediate, mandatory injunction freezing all corporate bank accounts associated with Aegis Crypt Solutions until the 40% equity transfer is fully executed." He took his seat. Across the aisle, my father smoothed his silk tie and shot me a triumphant, predatory smirk. Sloane crossed her arms, looking incredibly pleased with herself. They thought they had won. They thought the sheer volume of their fabricated evidence had crushed me. The presiding judge, an older, notoriously strict magistrate known for possessing zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, shifted his gaze to our table. He peered down through his reading glasses, his expression unreadable. "Counselor," the judge addressed Victor, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "Does the defense have a rebuttal to the plaintiff's request for an injunction, or shall I issue the order?" Victor stood up slowly. He casually buttoned his suit jacket, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying calm. He picked up the single, thin black folder from our table. "Your Honor, the defense does not have a rebuttal," Victor stated clearly, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent courtroom. "Because we are not here to debate a frivolous equity claim. We are here to file a motion for immediate dismissal with prejudice, accompanied by a formal request for federal judicial referral." My father's triumphant smirk faltered. The opposing counsel instantly jumped to his feet, objecting to the procedural deviation, but the judge raised a single hand, instantly silencing him. The judge gestured for Victor to approach the bench. Victor handed the thin black folder directly to the clerk, who passed it up to the magistrate. "The plaintiff has spent the morning attempting to convince this court that my client utilized family resources to build her cybersecurity firm," Victor began, pacing slowly in front of the bench. "If you turn to page 1 of that folder, Your Honor, you will find a commercial loan default notice from 9 years ago, when my client was 22 years old. It meticulously details how the plaintiff manipulated his daughter into guaranteeing a massive commercial debt for her sister, intentionally abandoned the payments, and utterly destroyed my client's credit history. My client built her multi-million-dollar company while entirely estranged, living in poverty, specifically because her father financially ruined her." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Sloane's posture stiffened. "But that is merely context, Your Honor," Victor continued, his voice dropping an octave, turning razor sharp. "The true nature of this lawsuit is detailed on page 4. The plaintiff is not suing my client for intellectual property. He is attempting to use this court as a weapon to execute a felony extortion scheme." "Objection!" my father's lawyer shouted, his face turning red. "This is outrageous slander." "Overruled," the judge snapped without looking up, his eyes aggressively scanning the forensic financial documents Victor had provided. Continue, counselor. The plaintiff's younger daughter, Sloan Baldwin, is currently operating a fraudulent, unlicensed Ponzi scheme disguised as a luxury retail brand, Victor stated, driving the final nail into the coffin. She has defrauded private investors out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. When the scheme began to collapse, Richard Baldwin liquidated his own assets to cover her tracks, committing massive tax evasion in the process. We have provided sworn affidavits, wire transfer logs, and Internal Revenue Service tracking numbers. Victor turned around, locking eyes with my father. During his sworn deposition, the plaintiff explicitly stated on the record that his family is a single financial entity and he controls all assets. He tied himself directly to his daughter's fraud. And now, facing federal indictment and pressure from unregulated underground lenders, he has come to this courthouse to try and steal 40% of a legitimate technology firm to pay off his criminal debts. The courtroom fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. The judge slowly closed the black folder. He took off his reading glasses and placed them deliberately on the wooden block. He did not look at the opposing counsel. He did not look at Sloan, who was now hyperventilating into her designer hands. The judge looked directly at Richard Baldwin. The look in the magistrate's eyes was one of pure, unadulterated disgust. He realized his courtroom, a sacred hall of justice, had just been used as a cheap tool to save a money-laundering fraud ring. The judge picked up his wooden gavel. He struck the sounding block with a sharp, violent crack that made my father physically jump in his seat. The judge leaned forward and delivered exactly 2 words that completely annihilated my father's entire universe. Criminal perjury? My father's face drained of all color, turning a sickening, translucent white. His hands began to shake violently against the mahogany table. This court will not be made a party to federal wire fraud and financial extortion, the judge thundered, his voice vibrating with absolute fury. This lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. The plaintiff is permanently barred from ever filing a claim against the defendant or her corporate entities again. Furthermore, I am ordering the court clerk to immediately unseal these defense exhibits and transfer the entire Baldwin family financial dossier directly to the regional directors of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service for immediate criminal prosecution. It was over. The execution was flawless. Sloan broke down into loud, ugly, hysterical sobs, completely destroying her carefully curated image. My father sat paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing silently as his highly paid lawyers furiously backed away from him, loudly declaring to the judge that they had no prior knowledge of these crimes. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply stood up and calmly adjusted the lapels of my tailored vest. I walked out from behind the defense table and proceeded down the center aisle. I walked right past my father, who was shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, and my sister, who was wailing about her ruined life. They were entirely broken, trapped in the prison they had spent a lifetime building. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom and stepped out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the Texas morning. I took a deep breath of the warm air. For the first time in 31 years, I stepped completely out of their shadow. I was untouchable. I was victorious. And most importantly, I was finally free. Thank you so much to everyone who stayed until the very end to listen to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today, so please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you found my journey compelling and want to help Maya Revenge Stories continue bringing you these incredible experiences, please consider supporting the channel with just a $1 donation. Your generosity allows us to pay our dedicated staff so they can support their families and keep creating high-quality content for you. You can easily donate by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Thank you again, and stay strong out there.